Hi, this is DrClyde, and we're on step 4 out of 6 on optimizing your metabolic exercise, looking at endurance training zones, which increases the supply to match the demand. Generally, you think of riding a bike, jogging, walking, swimming as cardiovascular exercise. But if you're doing it at a high enough intensity, where you call it a sprint, meaning you can't go longer than a few minutes, then that increases the demand. The adaptation is mainly in your neuromuscular system as opposed to your cardiovascular system. So swimming really fast it's the same movement as cardiovascular exercise, just like riding a bike or walking really fast, but it increases the demand. And so technically, in terms of how your body adapts to it, high intensity training or high intensity interval training, HIIT or HIIT, same thing, sprints, a few minutes or less, has more of an adaptation on the demand side, and therefore somewhat falls into a strengthening category. But the adaptation isn't just to get a little bit stronger from doing things at higher intensity, it's to increase the fat burning rate in your muscle. Because when you do things at a very short, in a very high intensity for a short period of time, it depletes the fuel so quickly that the muscle can't keep up. And that triggers DNA gene expression for increased fat burning machinery. And so for those of you that have a background and are trained in this, what I'm talking about is adenosine triphosphate being burned into adenosine monophosphate because the ADP in between can't be converted back into ATP fast enough. And the AMP activates adenosine monophosphate kinase, and that is the transcription factor that is driving fat burning for the next several days in response to HIIT, HIIT, or sprints, whatever you want to call it. So endurance intensities, less than or equal to a few minutes, we're going to call that a short sprint. Things that are that you can't maintain for longer than about 10 to 12 minutes, that's your VO2 max, maximum volumetric flow rate of oxygen, and therefore the highest rate of fat delivery and use. And we're going to call that a long sprint. So short sprints, 3 minutes or less. Long sprint, you could maintain for 10 to 12 minutes. Doesn't mean that you do it that long, just means that you could. And things that are around your 1 hour maximum effort, that's your threshold pace. Whether you want to think of it as an anaerobic, ventilatory, lactate threshold, doesn't matter. It's really an autonomic system or fight or flight system threshold that really encapsulates all of those changes. And things that you can do significantly longer than an hour, that is your genuine aerobic or cardiovascular target. And movement throughout the day is to keep your muscles idling. So how do we know that there's this maximally anaerobic effect to increase fat burning in muscle, to increase the demand on fat burning? Is there's this magic number of a few minutes or less. That comes from the systematic review on what exercise reduces cardiovascular disease risk factors. You can see the risk factors on the slide in front of you from this paper, and that high intensity exercise significantly improves the majority of these risk factors, whereas moderate intensity exercise does not, which then begs the question, how do we define high versus moderate intensity exercise? What's the difference? How hard do I have to work to achieve this beneficial effect? And here's what the researchers report. I'm summarizing it here, that it requires a high intensity stimulus, not a continuous prolonged effect, done above an intensity at a threshold where fatigue occurs within a few minutes or less, so less than or equal to 3 minutes, so that adenosine triphosphate depletes, lactate accumulates, and you're at close to your maximum heart rate. If prolonged intensity is attempted, intensity inevitably drops and confers less benefit. In other words, it doesn't matter how fit you are. It doesn't matter how fast you're moving, how fast you're swimming or walking in those 3 minutes. What matters is that you can't go faster without your intensity going down at the 3 minute point. So even if to everybody else, it looks like you're barely moving, if that's the most you can move, the fastest you can move for 3 minutes, then you have achieved the target for your body. And you are doing a sprint. Even if to everybody else, it looks like you're not walking. So for me, when I'm doing a long sprint, so let's say I'm on a stationary bike or on a treadmill or I'm on the trail and I'm going as hard as I can for 10 minutes, it's almost as fast as my 1 or 2 minute maximum efforts. If you saw me just for a few seconds, you wouldn't know if it was a short or a long sprint that I'm doing. So it is relative to your fitness level. It has nothing to do with what looks like a sprint to somebody else. So The studies that showed this effect had intense bouts interspersed by periods of recovery. So for example, 1 to 2 minutes at the higher intensity, and then the same length of time, 1 to 2 minutes at half that intensity to recover. Not just sitting or lying down, but moving to continue the blood flow. And this likely targets the nervous system, not just the muscular system, but not the heart in the way that lower intensity, longer exercise does. So practical application here for intervals or sprints. Let's say you're walking for 10 minutes and halfway through you walk briskly for 1 minute, and that meaning fast enough that you couldn't go longer than 3 minutes. Maybe you're going so fast you couldn't do it longer than 2 minutes or 1 minute. Now, what's wrong with only going 30 seconds, going really hard for 30 seconds? Well, creatine phosphate doesn't deplete until 20, 25 seconds. So you don't have the maximal depletion of adenosine triphosphate with a maximal effort that's around a half minute. So it's really the second half of the first minute where you're depleting ATP at the highest rate. And that's why there's an inflection point in maximum pace and output when you get to around 30 seconds. It's because of the loss of your first line of defense, which is creatine phosphate. So you want to go a whole minute. You wouldn't want to go less than that for this effect. I mean, if you're looking to launch off starting blocks on a race as fast as possible, then you're going to do shorter events. But for the effect that we're talking about here in your metabolic flow, it's 1 to 3 minutes. And the closer you get to 1 minute, probably the more intensive the effect and the greater the adaptation. So you're doing this brisk 1 to 3 minute walk within your 10-minute walk, and you'll do maybe 3 of those, for example. And that's as much as you need to do. Do that a couple times a week. If you go walking 10 times each day, on one day you could do the shorter sprints, a few of them, and then on the alternate days, do the longer sprint or the 10-minute effort. So the shorter efforts address your neuromuscular system. The long sprints, the 10-minute intensity, that addresses maximal delivery of oxygen and nutrients. So from the perspective of metabolic flow, this 1 to 3 minute maximum effort that we're calling intervals or sprints, it's the last step in your metabolic flow. It increases the demand within muscle, just like strength training, and particularly low resistance, high repetition strength training. And even more in particular, circuit type training, where there's not much rest for extended periods of time as you're doing the strengthening. So the intervals or sprints has that same type of effect. The fact that it helps against metabolic disease implies that fat burning within muscle itself is limiting for many people's health. But increasing the oxygen fat delivery, the supply part, to take advantage of that higher demand, forces you to not just do high intensity interval training. You have to do the VO2 max or the 10-minute pace type training. So from the perspective of metabolic flow, our 10-minute pace or VO2 max is offsets and balances out the demand component. So now you're increasing opening the floodgates to the delivery of oxygen and fats. Now, of course, if you're eating garbage, or then insulin will shut off the fat delivery, and it doesn't matter that you've done a bunch of long sprints, right? So nutrition, sleep, and stress management converge with these things. But all things being equal, you wouldn't want to just do high intensity training to maximize fat burning. You also want to increase the supply, which is the long sprints. I think of VO2 max as the great equalizer because the delivery of oxygen and fats really brings into play the lungs, heart, your whole circulation, delivery of nutrients from the intestinal tract, and fat release from your fat cells. Whatever is most limiting is going to adapt the most. So whatever system is strained the most adapts the most, which means it's going to equalize all of them so that they function equivalently. The bottleneck will automatically be discovered by what is under the greatest strain when you're doing your 10-minute race pace. It's a beautiful system. And that's why I think of the VO2 max pace as the great equalizer. So practical implications here. You're doing a 10-minute walk. Every other day, you're doing a 1 minute maximum effort, a few of those with slower in between. And the alternate days, you're doing a 4 to 8 minute effort at your 10-minute race pace. Now, you can go a full 10 minutes, but be careful about not changing your biomechanics. When you fatigue before your short or long sprint is up, Or if you do a 1 hour walk and your biomechanics is changing at the end of that and you didn't do any sprints at all, regardless, when you change your biomechanics, that means that the main muscle groups you're using for that movement are fatiguing, and that you're using other muscle groups to try to get the job done. That's when forces change across the joints and where your injury risk goes up dramatically. So when I say doing a set with strength training to failure or doing a sprint to failure, I mean with perfect form, with the same biomechanics that you would use in everyday life, that you started the set with, whether it's the sprint or the strength training. That biomechanics is what avoids the injury risk. It's a shift in forces across your joints where your biomechanics are changing. That's where the injury risk comes in. So when I say failure, I don't mean failure of connective tissue and muscles tearing in half, contusions, and literal injuries, not just the micro tears from exercise, but injury. That is past, that is a traumatic failure. So when I say exercise failure, I mean any change in biomechanics. So pay attention to that so that your exercise effort doesn't completely backfire. When I ruptured my disc, I couldn't exercise really for a year. In fact, it was painful to walk and I got headaches frequently. So I went from exercising that should ostensibly improve my health. Of course, I wasn't doing it for health. I just loved powerlifting, but to it hurting my health dramatically. My quality of life, I couldn't even walk or sit normally for a while. I had to get, ergonomics analysis and everything else. So don't let that happen. Don't let your effort backfire in that way. Pay attention to your biomechanics. When you can tell that you're walking differently, you're swimming differently, cycling differently, the last repetition is almost like a different exercise because you've changed it so much, your biomechanics, you stop right there. That's where you stop. Okay. Endurance intensities have their longest durations at a few minutes or less, around 10 minutes, around 1 hour, and significantly greater than an hour. And then very low intensity throughout the day. Those are our training zones. Very different effects in the body. This is my favorite paper on the threshold. You can see that there's changes in heart rate variability, adrenaline levels, blood glucose, lactate levels, blood pressure, oxygen levels, CO2 levels. All of them have inflection points around your 1 hour race pace. So the inflection point where you're breathing much harder, where your heart rate goes up at greater than linear, where lactate level has an inflection point in rising. All these things happen around your 1 hour race pace. Now, if you have a genetics towards a high level of fitness in endurance output, then your lactate threshold or these inflection and ventilatory threshold, anaerobic threshold might be closer to your 1.5 hour race pace. But the bottom line is they all occur within 5 to 10% of intensity with respect to each other, and your autonomic nervous system is clearly underlying many, and therefore in the end, ultimately all of these changes. And that's why I think of it as an autonomic threshold. Whether you call it ventilatory, anaerobic, or lactate threshold is really dependent on what you're measuring in a study. Like if you're measuring lactate, you call it lactate threshold. If you're measuring ventilatory rate, you'd call it that. But I think a better name would be the underlying mechanism, fight or flight or autonomic nervous system threshold. So where does that fall into our metabolic flow? Anaerobic is to the threshold is to trigger the whole system to ramp up its adaptation to the exercise. And at a lower intensity, this is where oxygen delivery goes up because ventilation goes up and circulation goes up because heart rate goes up. And even if the intensity is so low that it's barely detectable, that's called threshold 1. And that is where you're only getting benefits. The injury and damage that you have to recover from is minimal. And this is what's the low intensity for throughout the day or for extended periods of time, like building a fence or gardening or going on a long hike. These are the things that are most strongly correlated to long lifespan. For practical applications for threshold work, 1 hour race pace, and aerobic, so things that last longer than an hour, let's say you're walking for longer than 10 minutes with sprints occasionally, whether it's the 1 minute sprints or the 10 minute, and then A couple times a week, you're doing something for 20 to 40 minutes at a pace that you wouldn't be able to do longer than an hour. If you're going to go as long as an hour, then do it at a pace where your biomechanics absolutely does not change at that 1 hour point. And I highly recommend that at least once a week, you're doing each of these training zones. So at least once a week, you're going on a walk or doing some activity where there's a few 1 minute efforts with no biomechanical change at the end. At least once a week, a 10-minute effort, at least once a week, an intensity that you couldn't maintain for longer than an hour, even if you only do it half that long. And then at least once a week, a lower intensity that you do for an extended duration. And that's perfect for doing things with friends and family, like playing tennis for a couple hours or going on a hike or a bike ride with your family or friends. That's a perfect opportunity to make time in your schedule for a lower intensity, longer effort. That brings us to strength training, contractility, our next step.